I've been using Airbnb for years. From quirky downtown lofts to rustic cabins by the lake, I've seen it all. So when I booked a week-long stay in a small town to get some writing done, I thought nothing of it. The listing was simple: cozy private guest house near the woods. It seemed perfect, quiet, no distractions. The host, Rick, was a little different from what I was used to, though. He had a lengthy list of house rules in the description. Nothing strange at first. No pets, no smoking, no loud noise after 10 p.m. Pretty standard, right? But there was one line that stood out. Do not enter the main house under any circumstances. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was his property, and I had no reason to go into the main house. I'd be staying in the guest house, which looked quaint from the photos. Just a small bedroom, a kitchenette, and a bathroom. Perfect for someone who just wanted to hunker down and write. When I arrived, Rick was waiting outside the guest house. He was polite, but off. His eyes were wide, like he hadn't slept in days. His smile seemed plastered on his face, not quite reaching his eyes. He handed me the keys, reminded me of the house rules, and told me to text him if I needed anything. Then, without another word, he retreated into the main house, locking the door behind him. The guest house itself was fine, clean, cozy, but a little outdated. There was an odd smell, like old wood or mildew, but nothing too alarming. I unpacked and settled in for the night. That's when the weirdness started. At first, it was small things. The bathroom light flickered constantly, and no matter how many times I flipped the switch, it wouldn't stop. The floor creaked more than usual when I walked around, and there was a constant, low hum coming from the walls. I convinced myself it was just an old house, and I wasn't used to the sounds it made. But there was one thing that really bothered me. The guest house had no windows. I didn't realize it at first. I assumed it was just dark when I arrived, but after a while I noticed there wasn't a single window in the place. Not in the bedroom, not in the living area, not even in the bathroom. It was like being in a box. A part of me thought about texting Rick, asking if there was another guest house, one with windows, but I didn't want to seem rude. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor in the main house. I figured Rick was moving furniture or something, so I ignored it. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like something or someone was being pulled across the floor, slowly. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the sound persisted. A soft scraping right beneath me, almost like it was coming from under the guest house itself. I barely slept. The next morning, I messaged Rick, asking him if he had been moving things around late at night. His response came quickly. No, I was asleep. Are you sure you weren't just hearing things? This house makes weird noises sometimes. I shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach. As the day went on, things got stranger. I tried to focus on my writing, but I couldn't concentrate. Every so often I'd hear something, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the guest house, though. It was coming from the main house. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. When I stepped outside, I noticed something odd about the main house. All the windows were covered. Not just with curtains or blinds, but with something else, wooden boards nailed over them. It looked like the house had been abandoned or condemned, but Rick clearly lived there. I couldn't help myself. I approached the main house and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear any movement inside, but all I could make out was that strange hum, like the one I'd heard in the guest house. It was louder here, almost vibrating through the door. I backed away and decided to spend the rest of the day in town, hoping the weirdness would pass. When I returned later that evening, Rick was waiting outside. His expression was stern, and his eyes were even wider than before. "Did you try to enter the house?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "No," I lied. "I just went for a walk." He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good. Remember the rules." That night, the noises got worse. The scraping beneath the guest house grew louder, more aggressive, like something was desperately trying to claw its way out. I pressed my ear to the floor, and I could swear I heard breathing. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and texted Rick. No answer. Then, just after midnight, I heard it. A soft knock on the door to the guest house. I froze, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. My heart was racing and I couldn't move. Finally, I mustered the courage to approach the door. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response, just more knocking, insistent and rhythmic. I grabbed my phone and called Rick, but it went straight to voicemail. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, it stopped, and I stood there in the silence, too afraid to open the door. I didn't sleep that night, and by the time morning came, I was ready to leave. As I packed my things, I noticed something odd near the front door. A small folded note. I hadn't seen it before, but there it was, as if it had been slipped under the door during the night. I unfolded it, and my blood ran cold. Written in shaky, jagged letters were the words, "Help me." I threw my stuff into my car and left without looking back. I never got an explanation from Rick. He didn't respond to my messages after I left. I reported the listing to Airbnb, but the next time I checked, it was gone, like it never existed. I still wonder what was beneath that guest house and why the windows of the main house were boarded up, but I'll never go back to find out. I'll never forget this experience. I was so excited for a solo trip, looking for some peace and quiet in a little town a few hours from home. I found this quaint, cozy Airbnb, a charming cabin just on the edge of the woods. The host had great reviews, and honestly, the pictures made it look like the perfect place for a retreat. I booked it immediately. Everything started off fine. I arrived late in the afternoon, and the check-in was smooth. The host messaged me a few hours after I settled in, just to make sure I was comfortable. He mentioned that he lived a few miles away, but that if I needed anything, he'd be available. That seemed reassuring at the time. The first night it was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep quickly. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. that I woke up to this strange tapping noise on the window. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was an animal, but the tapping persisted. I got out of bed to check, but there was nothing outside. The next morning, I found what looked like faint scratches near the window. I tried to shrug it off, but something about it felt off. I chalked it up to paranoia and went about my day, exploring the nearby town. Still, there was this uneasy feeling gnawing at me, like I was being watched. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before bed. I even pushed a chair against the front door, just for peace of mind. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again to the same tapping noise. Only this time it was louder and more frantic. It wasn't just one window. It felt like it was coming from all around the cabin. I grabbed my phone and went to message the host, but there was no signal. In a panic, I searched for the Wi-Fi, but it had been disconnected. My heart was racing. I was trying to figure out what to do when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. That's when I saw him. A figure standing by the back door, wearing a hood. He was just standing there, staring at the door, like he was waiting for something. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind was racing. Was this the host? Was this some intruder? Then the doorknob rattled. Slowly at first, but then more aggressively. I remember my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I scrambled to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My only thought was to hide. I ducked into the closet, phone in hand, trying desperately to get a signal. And then I heard it. The front door opening. That chair I'd wedged against the door, it didn't do a thing. Whoever it was had just walked right in. I could hear him moving through the cabin, footsteps slow and deliberate, like he was looking for something. Or someone. I swear I could hear my own heartbeat in that silence and the sound of him getting closer. The doorknob to the bedroom turned next. It creaked open, and I knew he was inside the room. I held my breath, gripping my phone like it was some kind of weapon. Then the closet door started to move. Just a tiny crack at first. I could see his shadow through the sliver of light. I was seconds away from screaming when suddenly he stopped. I heard him mutter something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. And then, like some nightmare had ended, I heard him leave. The footsteps retreated, the front door clicked shut. I stayed in that closet until dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. When the sun finally came up, I ran out of there, got in my car, and drove straight to the nearest town where I could get a signal. I reported the incident to Airbnb and the authorities, but they didn't find anyone. The host denied everything, said he didn't know what happened, and acted shocked when he heard my story. But something about the way he responded made my skin crawl, like he knew more than he was letting on. To this day, I don't know who that was or what he wanted, but I never stayed in an Airbnb again. I had always been a big fan of Airbnb, unique places, good prices, and the chance to meet some cool people. That changed after my last trip, where I came way too close to something I still can't fully explain. It was last summer when I decided to visit a small coastal town to get away from the city. I found a beautiful, secluded Airbnb listing, an old house from the 1800s, nestled in the woods with views of the ocean. It was perfect. The host, Clara, seemed friendly enough online, and the reviews were decent, mostly positive. The few neutral ones said the place was old-fashioned and a little isolated. That didn't bother me. I wanted some peace and quiet. When I arrived, the house was just as charming as the photos had shown. A tall, weathered building with ivy crawling up the sides and a porch that creaked underfoot. Clara wasn't there to meet me in person, but she had left the key under a flower pot, just as she said she would. The moment I stepped inside, though, something felt off. It was unusually cold for a summer afternoon, and the air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. I shrugged it off, figuring it was an old house and maybe Clara hadn't been there recently. After settling in, I explored a bit. The kitchen was quaint with vintage appliances and faded wallpaper. The living room had a big stone fireplace, which I instantly loved. As I wandered upstairs, I noticed that one of the rooms at the end of the hallway was locked. That struck me as a little odd. Airbnb hosts typically inform you if any part of the house is off limits, but Clara hadn't mentioned anything about a locked room. I texted her out of curiosity. "Hey, just noticed one of the rooms upstairs is locked. Is that normal?" About 20 minutes later, she replied, "Yes, that's just for storage. Please don't worry about it." Okay, fine, no big deal. But something about the locked door gnawed at me. That first night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing odd creaks and shuffling noises from upstairs, like someone was walking around in the hallway. At first, I told myself it was the house settling or maybe an animal on the roof. But the more I listened, the more deliberate the sound seemed, as if someone was pacing slowly, back and forth. I wanted to check it out, but the idea of going upstairs in the dark gave me a bad feeling. In the morning, I went upstairs to investigate, but nothing seemed out of place. The hallway was empty, the door still locked. Later that day, I decided to take a walk into town. As I was leaving, I saw a neighbor out front, a middle-aged man walking his dog. He waved and I walked over to introduce myself. We got to chatting, and when I mentioned I was staying at Clara's Airbnb, his expression changed. He looked uneasy, then said, "Oh, you're staying at that place. You know about the house, right?" I shook my head. He hesitated, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then whispered, "That house. People say it's haunted. There used to be a family living there decades ago. The husband went crazy, locked his wife and daughter in one of the rooms upstairs. They never made it out." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "That's just a story, right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me a grim smile. "Believe what you want, but folks around here don't stay in that house for long." I laughed it off, but the thought nagged at me all afternoon. Back at the house, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. I found myself staring at the locked door again, wondering if that was the room. Was there really something behind that door? Or was it all just small-town gossip? That night, the noises started again. Footsteps, soft but distinct, pacing back and forth. This time, I couldn't ignore it. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone and quietly crept upstairs. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. As I stood in front of the locked door, I noticed something I hadn't before. Scratches on the wood, like someone had clawed at it from the inside. My breath caught in my throat. I bent down, putting my ear to the door. For a moment, there was silence, and then I heard it, a faint, muffled sound. It was a woman's voice whispering, "Let me out." I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. My first instinct was to run, but I felt glued to the spot. My hands were trembling as I called Clara, praying she would pick up. She answered on the third ring. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy. I think someone's in the house," I whispered. "I'm hearing noises from the locked room." There was a long pause on her end, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was flat, almost mechanical. "There's no one in the house." "But I can hear someone." "I said there's no one in the house," she repeated, and then the line went dead. That was enough for me. I grabbed my things, ran to the car, and sped off without looking back. I left the key under the flower pot as instructed and drove through the night, not stopping until I was far away from that house.